Hi, everybody. Hi to everybody here and those of you streaming on YouTube. All of our readings are archived on the Paula Cooper Gallery Studio website. And welcome to the paperback launch of The Dream Colony, A Life in Art by Walter Hopps, edited by Deborah Treisman from interviews with Anne Doran, and they'll be moderated by David Salle. I did that on purpose. Sorry. Walter Hopps was an innovative, iconoclastic curator of contemporary art. He founded his first gallery at the age of 21. At 24, he opened the Ferris Gallery with the then unknown artist Edward Kienholz. Ferris turned the spotlight on a new generation of West Coast artists, premiered Andy Warhol's Campbell's Soup Cans, and was at one point shut down by the LA Vice Squad for a show of Wallace Berman's edgy art. In the 60s, Hopps mounted the first museum retrospective of Marcel Duchamp and Joseph Cornell, and the first museum exhibition of pop art before it was even known as pop art. When Hopps became the director of Washington's Corcoran Gallery of Art at age 34, the New York Times hailed him as the most gifted museum man on the West Coast and in the field of contemporary art, possibly in the nation. A few years before his death in 2005, Hopps began work on this book, a vivid, personal, surprising, irreverent, and enlightened account of his life. Deborah Treisman has been the fiction editor of The New Yorker since 2003 and is the host of the award-winning New Yorker fiction podcast. She was formerly the managing editor of the art and literary quarterly Grand Street, for which Walter Hopps was an art editor. Anne Doran is an artist and writer and editor for the visual arts. She has written for Art Forum, Art in America, Art News, Moose, Collector Daily, Time Out New York, and Tricycle, The Buddhist Review. From 96 to 04, she was an editor at the Art and Literary Quarterly Grand Street. And finally, David Salle helped define the postmodern sensibility by combining figuration with an extremely varied pictorial language. Solo exhibitions of his work have been held at museums and galleries worldwide, and Salle's paintings are in permanent collections of major museums throughout New York as well. The book is available for sale after the event, and there will be time for a Q&A session afterward. Thank you.
Thanks for the introduction. Can you hear? Not really. Not really. Okay. How about
Are these
that?
mics on? Yeah, now they are.
So, how many people have read the book? Fair number. Okay. So we kind of know what we're talking about. I had the good fortune of doing 2 exhibitions that Walter curated. So I got to work with him very closely on 2 occasions. The first time was a very small show at the Menil Museum, just one room. I think we had 5 pictures. And when I sat down this evening, Deborah asked me how I met Walter, and I had to say I actually can't remember how the meeting came about. He was someone who it was as if I had always known him. There was a deep familiarity from the very beginning, but I don't know when the beginning was, if it was 1985 or earlier than 85, sometime in the mid-80s. I'm thinking we must have met through Philip Johnson and David Whitney, but I just can't remember. But by 1987, we were in very regular contact. I would visit the studio. I was at the time also working as a designer for the Carol Armitage Dance Company. And Walter was keenly interested in the performing arts as well, and dance, and avant-garde dance, and avant-garde music. So Walter, when he was in town, unannounced, I don't even know how he knew the schedule, of the rehearsal schedule. We'd be in rehearsal at some dance studio on 19th Street somewhere, and all of a sudden Walter would appear with his, looking as he always did, like a CIA man with his raincoat, dark suit, white shirt, dark tie, hat. No one even wore hats anymore at that point. And he would sit like so with his briefcase, take his hat off, like he was sitting at a, I don't know where, like a sitting church or something. Sit for an hour, watch rehearsal, get up and leave without saying a word to anybody. This happened repeatedly. And I always wondered, how did he even know where to come or what the schedule was? Anyway, that was a question you didn't need to ask Walter, because he was hearing things from the ether that other people couldn't hear. But the thing I wanted to note about the first occasion of actually working with him, installing a show, was something that was brought into sharp focus in the book when Walter talks about visiting Franz Klein's studio. And there's a description of watching Klein paint, which is very deliberate. We have sometimes think of Franz Klein as the quintessential expressionist brushstroke artist, but in fact the paintings were very meticulously painted over a period of time. What looks like was an immediate one go was in fact built up over layers and layers. But the part that resonated with me was when Walter says that Franz Klein would just sat and looked at the painting, and then with a very deliberate gesture made a gesture on the painting, and then sat back down again and lit a couple of cigarettes. And it was that couple of cigarettes, in Franz Klein's case, 2 cigarettes, then precipitated the next brushstroke. And I sat down, another 2 cigarettes. So Walter, when he was installing a show, I think many people could tell you a version of the same story. The cigarette was his clock, because Walter was famously not beholden to clock time. He just did things whenever he did things, whenever they needed to be done in his mind. But we were on the clock. There was a union crew installing the show, but no one could do anything without Walter's signal. So the way it worked was Walter would stand in the middle of the gallery with a cigarette until the entire cigarette had turned to ash. He never flicked the ashes, he never put the thing out. He just smoked it until it was ash, and then boom, he would move a painting. He'd come back to the center of the room, light another cigarette, and that's how it went. Cigarette, move painting, cigarette, move painting. And we got the show done. So I don't know why I'm starting with that anecdote, but it's a beautiful book. I'm so grateful to Deborah and to Anne, and of course to Walter for producing the book, but and also to Ed Richet for the introduction, which is wonderful. What is the book about? The book is about how culture is transmitted, how a sensibility is transmitted across generations and across geographic space, California to New York to Houston to Paris to London. The way information travels before the internet in a kind of confidential, bringing people into your confidence kind of way. So that to me was the feeling of the book that I feel most moved by, and also most close to, and also that I miss the most in the modern world. So with that, Deborah.
Yeah, it's interesting because Walter had a sort of Ethernet as opposed to the internet, and things just reached him somehow. And you really have a sense when from my point of view, this book came about because I listened to tapes, and I knew Walter when I worked at Grand Street, and Walter had this brilliance whenever he was talking, but he wasn't comfortable writing, and he would sort of shut down when he was the one doing the writing. He would feel pressure to speak in academic art terms and so on, which weren't his language for talking about art. So he had to write produce notes on artists that were published in Grand Street at the time, and we developed a habit of having him talk on the phone or on tape, and then I would somehow turn this into a written piece, but without, structurally organizing it, creating sentences where there weren't sentences, but without adding content or really drastically changing any words. They were his words. And when it came, we hit a certain point. I had left Grand Street already. I'd moved to the New Yorker, and it was just a sense that Walter had so many stories, and nobody wanted these to die with him. He would tell them again and again. He always had another one, in my experience, to tell. And there was a sense that it just would be a huge loss in terms of art history as well as personal history not to get these down in some kind of readable form. So Anne and I developed a plan with Walter, and Anne had known Walter for decades at that point, where she would sit with him in Houston and poke a finger in a spot that triggered memory, basically, and ask him about different times in his life, and he would then talk for hours. So I ended up with about 100 hours of tapes. Do you want to jump in and say something?
No, it's just it was a lot of material. Deborah did an amazing job.
I ended up with
organizing it.
About 100 hours, and I literally transcribed every one. And that way I felt his voice going through me, and I was actually cleaning things up as I went with the transcriptions so that I had this elaborate index of what was on each tape and what was in each transcript, so that when he told the same story on tape 33 and 57 and 99, I could instantly find those three versions of that story and somehow meld them to make the most complete version I could. But I really felt his voice going through me with this book, and so I feel that people who knew Walter recognize him in this book and don't feel they're hearing from someone else. And that was the most important. But along the way, I felt very much on this sort of channel up in the air of news and art and perception, and really the quality about Walter that was for me the most salient was just the excitement about anyone doing anything new or different, or this air of discovery with every piece of art he looked at. The sort of thrill of someone who would do a show where he says he'll hang any piece of art that anyone brings, a 24-hour show, and people walk up and he hangs their work. Doesn't matter, there's no judgment. And simply in the juxtaposition of the works that he's hanging, you discover another work. That in itself is an artwork. That sort of captures him for me, I think. How about you?
Oh, Walter, yes. No, I was thinking about the ether versus the web. But I was thinking about you, David, too, because I was rereading an interview I did with Toby Camps at the Menil about Walter, and Toby was talking about how Walter always used to talk about discovering artists, that how you discovered new artists back in the 50s in LA was you listened to the poets, because the poets really got around. And so the poets would tell him what was really happening. And but I was thinking, in the 36-hour show, 36,
not 24.
Yeah, it was a long show. I was in that show. That Walter in some ways did anticipate the internet, though. I mean, with shows like he also proposed to Atlanta Heights when she was running PS1 that he fill PS1 with photographs, every wall, floor to ceiling, wall-to-wall photographs, every single different kind of photograph. News photographs, art photographs, everything. She never did it, but it would have, he figured, been about 100,000 photographs. So I think that he, in some ways, anticipated the internet. But, so I was going to ask you, David, you weren't working with AI when you knew Walter, were you?
Hardly. It's funny.
I think he would have liked it.
Oh, I think, well, he certainly would have loved Instagram. Probably would have been on it all day long. But the thing that you brought up about the non-juried show, Walter had an amazing non-judgmental side,
Mm-hmm.
an amazing capacity for acceptance of A, people on their own terms, and B, whatever someone did in the name of art, or even in the direction of art, or even if they themselves didn't know they were making art, didn't bother to call it that. He had a truly remarkable acceptance and curiosity about things that other people would overlook. At the same time, it's not a contradiction. It's a duality which is essential, I think, for anybody working in the arts, and certainly was one of the hallmarks of his character, is that at the same time he could be open to just about anything. He's very specific about what had real value, what had real quality, who was doing what, and who was truly remarkable, and what work soared above others. Not that it was a hierarchy per se, but it would have been, he couldn't have been a museum person if he hadn't been able to and had actually been driven to make distinctions. So what is who's doing the most interesting thing, or the most radical thing, or the most groundbreaking thing? He had no trouble making those judgments and distinctions. At the same time, he could be incredibly generous to just about anything that moved. I sometimes think that duality is I mean, it's a very rare combination to the degree to which Walter had both. I mean, we have people who are anything goes, and we have people who are incredibly hierarchical, and we have very, very few people who can do both. He had no problem making connections between things, and the connections were not generational and not always necessarily even media specific. When I read what Walter says about various artists, what I remember what he said to me about various artists, about my work, for example, it's clear that the net result of this acceptance, it's a little bit hard to describe what I'm thinking, but the net result of this broad acceptance colored his, or influenced his, or enabled his ability to understand that something, although it might look very different, was actually working with a similar sensibility as something that came before, so that you could understand that, for example, going back to my example of Carol Armitage, who was, if you just read what the critics said, she was much more than I was. She was the poster child for postmodernism, whatever the hell that meant. But Walter, who wasn't even a dance person really, first time he saw her work, he said, "Oh, I get it. It's classicism with modern music," which is exactly what it was. I mean, there was no aspect of it that was not grounded in classical vocabulary, and Walter knew that without even knowing the vocabulary himself. But that was something that the New York Times critics couldn't see, for example. So that you have to be open to be able to make connections that are actually accurate and actually propel your thinking forward. Because most people's idea of connections is, all you people here on the left side of the room, or all you people who are under a certain age, or the 40 people under 40, or whatever nonsense. I mean, Walter his brain never worked like that. It just worked like, oh, I see this is really this thing, but inside out. Or if you could imagine this thing in 200 years, it would look like that thing. It was a plasticity of understanding that art is, and it sounds like such a simple thing to say, it's almost tautological or almost kind of insults your intelligence, but it's actually something that needs to be repeated, that art is made by people, and therefore there is something that it all has in common, because people have something in common, if that makes any sense. You know what I mean?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the fact that he liked to hang children's art
Right.
tells you
Right.
something about,
Yeah, I
you
love
know,
that, yeah.
what he was looking for in a piece, which was maybe just investment, personal investment somehow.
Personal investment, authenticity.
Yeah.
It was not theoretical. It was not theory based. It
No.
was visual. Whatever it was visual. That was, I mean, as again, as elementary as that sounds, the culture has so much deviated from that. We need to be reminded of it.
Yeah, I would say that Walter's exhibitions were rarely based in any kind of academic theory. They were, well, it was a little more than, he taught me so much about art. I mean, looking at art with Walter, or looking at Walter's shows, taught me everything I needed to know about art, I think. Other people might argue that it wasn't, but yeah, I learned so much from looking at his shows or going through shows with him and hearing about those connections. They were intuitive, visual, philosophical, sort of brilliant. Yeah, but they weren't. He never hung a show that the Menil still has galleries that he hung, and I was just there in the spring, and I spent an afternoon in them, thinking, just marveling. I mean, at how beautiful they are. I also interviewed Bill Agee at one point, who talked about hanging a show with Walter at the Menil. Bill had curated San Francis show. It was a San Francis show, and he said, you know, Walter was lauded for a number of things, also for being a character and for being eccentric, but for being brilliant, a genius, a maverick, blah. But he said no one ever told me he was such a technician in terms of hanging a show. It took him many cigarettes. He mentioned the cigarettes, but that everything had to be at a certain height. Everything had to be a certain distance apart. Every piece had to sort of sing with the pieces around it and inform the pieces around it. And Bill said, I had never worked with anyone who was that obsessive about hanging a show. That was your experience,
yes,
right?
Absolutely. There's so many passages in the book that stand out remarkable. One, and it's hard to make this not feel nostalgic. I guess it is nostalgic on a certain level, but I mean, one question that I have in the back of my mind, which we could throw out to the audience, is there anyone working today who is in any way similar or works in a similar manner to Walter? Does anyone remind us of Walter? I don't know. But if you read the book, the sections about Rauschenberg, and obviously Bob and Walter were very, very close. But Walter understands, and he understands the content, the narrative content that is underlying Bob's choices, and he makes the combines and the collage paintings. And I've always thought that Bob's work was literally an open book. You could just read it like someone's telling you a story from their childhood. And Walter, of course, got it immediately, and no one else. I mean, people have labored for decades to interpret Canyon. What does it mean? What's the eagle mean? What does the field mean? This, he's thinking about his son, and it's, soft landing. Well, it's in a way it's kind of obvious, and it's charming as hell. At least I find it so. But even that certainty is a function of his humanity and his function of the connection to the idea that art is made by people and it's not actually something that just falls to earth. It has to be subjected to all these different categories. I just found that to be wonderfully satisfying to know there was somebody out there who could look at a painting not as a conundrum because Bob made this painting called Rebus, everyone assumed that everything that he made was Rebus-like, but of course the Rebus actually makes no sense at all. It's just a title he liked. But the other paintings are as legible as E.M. Forster story. All I'm really saying is I just wish we had people like that now. I don't know who that person is.
Well, back to your question about whether or not there are people out there still doing the same thing. No, there aren't, I don't think.
Yeah.
And
there
to be honest,
weren't then, actually.
No, to be honest, Walter lost a lot of jobs. He was fired numerous times for being what he was.
Disappearing for days.
Yeah, or Toby said he used to call into the Menil and say, I'll be late to the meeting, and Toby would say, where are you? And he'd say, Madrid.
Yeah. I remember when Walter went to the Menil. I never met Mrs. de Menil. I knew the children, but I never met her. But friends of mine who knew her quite well, basically everyone said the same thing. Oh, Dominique is the only person who can handle Walter. That she'll manage him in a way which will be productive for everybody, but no one else could do it. She was the only one who could do it, and it was extremely productive.
He loved her.
Yeah.
He really loved her.
Yeah.
He was also a bit older at that point,
Right.
and a little more in control, I
yeah.
think, in his own life.
I think
But-
I thought it was that, I've always thought it was because Mrs. de Menil had total faith in him and let him do whatever he wanted. In return, he showed up on time, or more or less on time.
Well, I think also he had enormous respect for them, for the de Menils,
Yes.
and understood what they represented. Although I never met Mrs. de Menil, Walter did take me to the house when one of my trips to Houston. She was out of town, but of course he had a key to the house, and he said, "Oh, I got to show you the house." And we just drove, and we just let ourselves in and showed me around. In a way, it was better that she wasn't there. I got to just poke around, and look in all the closets, and you could see the closets that Charles James had lined with chartreuse felt and whatnot. And we went into her bedroom. Walter pointed out that this whole empire was run from a card table set up next to her bed with a rotary phone on it, and that was the Menil Museum control center, was the card table, and a little crucifix over her bed. It was all very simple, and the work was great. And I came back to New York and I saw Philip Johnson, and I said, "Oh, Philip, I was in the Menil house in Houston." And Philip said, "Oh, how can she still live in that shithole?"
He was the architect.
Right. It was his second house after the glass house. Yeah.
It's a beautiful house.
It's really beautiful.
I guess one thing that feels salient to me about Walter is that this book is full of his enthusiasms. It's full of the work that he loved that triggered him. I don't think, it's been a little while since we put it out, but I don't think there's a negative word about any artist.
This used to drive his friends a little bit crazy.
I mean, but I feel as though now you think, okay, well, if you're a kind of arbiter in any art form, you have the things you admire, and then you have judgment, which tells you that these things are bad. He didn't bother with that part, I don't think.
Well, no, I think David's right. He had definite ideas about what was important and what was better than other things, and he was incredibly accepting of everything else and saw all of it as a kind of part of this his cosmos, where he knew every part of that cosmos and everything's place in that cosmos. What he didn't do was, if someone was making good art, he didn't care what kind of person they were. I mean, this used to drive his wife and his friends a little bit crazy. I won't name names, but you would say, Walter, that person is just an awful person. And he'd be like, but they are such a good artist. And they would be, you know.
Yeah.
And
That-
he used
that
to
is a-
constantly have me put up artists at my home, some of whom didn't leave for 4 or 5 months, and I had to, you know.
Well, that was true in his own house as well, yeah.
Yes, I'm afraid it was. Yeah.
Yeah, I know.
They usually turned up because his wife had already thrown them out of their house.
Right. I mean, I can't remember who it was. He does say a couple of times here that since he was a bad painter, but they're people wouldn't remember anymore.
Yeah.
That's not very often.
Speaking of which, there was always supposed to be a chapter that never really got directly addressed while Walter was alive, which was Los Olvidados, the artists who were forgotten, whom he'd known and who were important to him. And some of them pop up in the course of the book, but he was really obsessed with this idea of setting aside space in this book to talk about them. That's, a bit of a loss that he didn't quite get there.
Right. There are always people who are not remembered, who should be remembered. There was this also the interweaving in his conception of art, interweaving art and music. I was for a while on his call list. I mean, not that he had a list, but he would just call whoever was on his mind. So sometimes I get a call from Walter at 2 in the afternoon or 2 in the morning, and he would just start talking. Walter, hi. What's on your mind? At least an hour of Civil War history. I don't know why that was. So then, usually something about baseball, and then the real subject was jazz. So like, have you heard this record, this Coltrane record? Well, I think I heard it. I don't really remember. And he would go into great detail. He thought about music a lot, and it worked on him in a visceral way. His connection to it was so deep. I thought the musicality as an idea was part of his worldview and part of his curatorial brilliance. That things had a rhythm, things had a sequence. He understood the nature of intervals and the nature of ratios. And the other thing I had forgotten, I think I must have known, but I've forgotten that Walter had a science background before he became involved in art. And there's one point when he's talking about, I can't remember what he's talking about, maybe talking about Frank Stella. Yes, he's talking about Stella's early block paintings. And he said they're matter, but they're also spirit. He doesn't use the word spirit. They're matter and they're also idea, which is nothing if not a statement of the precepts of alchemy. And he was steeped in the idea of matter is a real thing, and art is matter. Art uses matter. It's made from matter. It has matter, and it also has idea. And they're different but interconnected. Again, these things sound so simple when you put them to words. They're conceptually they're not simple and they're not common, and they need to be, I think, brought more out in the open. But I hadn't really quite clocked the degree to which Walter's early training in chemistry and physics and mathematics informed his pragmatism, which kind of visual, tactile pragmatism, which maybe all curators should become chemists first. Maybe this is a clue to what's missing in the grad schools. Don't read Derrida. Go just take organic chemistry and be more useful.
You and Walter talked a lot about books, didn't you?
A lot about books.
We're in a bookstore. What
did he recommend?
What did he recommend?
Well, we talk mostly about poets.
Really?
And my education in poetry is very limited, so he always led. interested in some of the same poets. I was interested in New York School poets primarily, as was he. So we just talked about who we liked and which poems we liked. We also talked about novels also, although I don't remember talking about those so much. We talked about movies. He was a film buff at a point in my life when I was kind of actively studying movies. He understood how things were put together. So what is it? A movie is nothing if not an assemblage of stuff.
Artwork.
And I think it's Walter could understand what Bob was doing in the Combine paintings and the assemblage paintings. Again, because of this idea of the physicality of matter. Even though movies aren't physical, movies are just light. He understood that movies are an assembly of these different components. You know, it was a pragmatic approach to life, to the world, to what people made, what people did. I don't know why that seems so elusive today, but it does.
Well, maybe we should take some audience questions at this point, if there are some. If there are none, we we can go on talking. But
Are there
yeah.
any examples of his photographs in collections, or was he a photographer early on?
He
Had friendships with some of the greats.
he was a photographer. He was a good one.
Yeah.
And he also did a lot of photo collages. Yeah, he was a good photographer, and he did photo collages. They are not in collections. His wife has them in their house in Pasadena. They're really interesting. He also he told me once that he had decided to give up art pretty early on because he thought it would make him crazy.
That's probably true.
Undoubtedly true.
It did make him crazy many times.
His own art was going to really,
Yeah.
really put him over the
Yeah.
top.
Yeah.
though.
That's true.
But they're interesting. He was a good artist. I think he gave it up when he, at least sometime before he took the job at Pasadena, when he was 24. 24?
28.
28? And
Yeah.
I think even
Yeah.
before then, possibly.
Yeah, I also love reading about the meeting with the Arnsbergs, seeing that collection and being invited back again and again to come wherever he wanted to look at the collection. And that the fortuitousness of that meeting, like what would have happened if he had never met the Arnsbergs? When he did, that was incredibly receptive time in one's life. And how incredible that they were so receptive to him. They had no children, so they weren't distracted by a lot of things, and gave him free rein of the collection. That's kind of origin story. It's so magical that if it hadn't happened, we would have had to invent it for Walter posthumously, because it springs him like a springs him into the world of visual phenomena in such a clear way that we can really just point to, like, oh, yeah, I met them when he was that age, and never really looked back. So yeah, I think that's also something which is, because with California, there was no other place to look at. I mean, if you grew up in New York, you just go to MoMA and look at art. But in LA,
There wasn't a lot.
something like that.
There wasn't
Yeah,
a lot.
yeah.
There were a few things. There was Bill Copley's gallery that he went to. There was, what was the one in the movie theater?
Oh,
There was a movie theater that was also a
yeah,
gallery.
where he hung art in the
Mhm,
lobby. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and there were a few, but not much.
I have it's sort of more of a comment than a question.
Mhm.
It's kind of related to the California thing, but it seems like in his first major exhibition, which was like the Santa Monica Pier exhibition,
The
1955,
the carousel
he was
carousel show.
exhibiting pretty much like abstract expressionist works, I guess. And it seemed like pretty soon after that, he kind of turned his attention to pop or proto-pop arts, maybe like to a more sort of native Californian thing,
Mhm.
something with more
Funk.
irony or humor or something.
Maybe
Does that
more.
make sense?
Yeah. Well, the abstract expressionists were pretty well established by that time. out there too, as well as here. And Walter always was looking for the new. I always thought that he already knew what he was looking for. Walter could sort of see what should happen with art next. And when he saw it, he recognized it because he'd already thought it up, basically. So I think the new always excited him more than, also, yeah, they were expensive and hard to get, and they were already represented. So, yeah. But I think it had a lot to do with looking for the new.
Yeah, I don't get the sense it was about pop art per se, because of course, as he takes pains to point out, it wasn't even named pop art yet. But the trajectory was something like this, that the art world had been immersed in abstraction, the language of abstraction for several decades, a couple of decades anyway. And everyone knew that that work was beginning to show signs of fatigue. So it just made sense that what would come next was something that was involved with images, image-based, or using the language of imagery, which is what had to have been rejected in the 1930s and 40s in order for American art to get anywhere. But that had been accomplished. So not that I'm not talking about some nonsensical pendulum swing. It just, there are only so many stories to tell in painting, and if the story of abstraction is visibly losing steam, the next story is going to be something to do with images. I don't think Wolf necessarily knew what it was going to look like, but the artists were already doing it, so then it was easy for him to say, that's it, that's the next thing. And then there was another next thing, and another next thing, another next thing, so on and so forth.
He remained a fan of abstract expressionism. He loved Clifford Still and a couple of the West Coast abstract artists. But yeah, they'd gotten expensive and hard to show. Insurance was high.
Even then.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sort of adding on to that, the newness, have there been any artists or films or music or any contemporary things post his passing that you've been like, oh, Walter would have loved that, or I would really like to know what he would think about that, and perhaps maybe there's not, but I'm just curious.
I think I think about that all the time. I probably do. He lives in my head, you know. When I look at,
lives in my head too.
It's not funny, right? He lives in my head when I look at art.
Yeah, dozens and dozens and dozens of things.
Yeah,
You would have
I'm.
loved and responded to, and would have loved to know what he thought. Endless. Yeah.
You've put me on the spot, though.
Sorry.
And I'm kind of drawing a bit of a blank, but
He's also spinning his grave.
Yeah.
yeah. Behind the door. No, it'll come to me in like 30 seconds. Let's move on, and I'll
We'll come back to that.
we'll come back to that,
Or that.
unless David has some ideas.
I have a question about what he personally collected, but what he never gave, say, to the Menil, or what he gave to the Menil, if that was the place to present art.
Oh,
I mean, I know there's a single stack Judd, which is
What?
surprising, that he donated, and also Wallace Berman, and that shows the range of his, wonderful range of his. But what did he personally keep? Are there things still in Pasadena that have never been?
his widow, Caroline, just made a big bequest to the Menil. Most of it went to the Menil.
Great.
Yeah, most of it did. A lot of it was not what people would call important art. It was largely smaller works that people had given him. People gave him art all the time. He was adored. Also, he sort of was light-fingered a little bit. That happened. And then Walter was constantly in financial trouble, so that some of the more major works that he actually invested in went to
Pay the bills.
pay the bills. Yeah.
But it's actually a theme in the book, and especially the early years, how thievery is a viable and respected way to get through life. There's so many of the things are just boosted. I mean, you need something for the gallery. Well, just go get it.
Yes.
You don't need money.
Steal this book.
Money's kind of like for squares. So that I love that this it's like a solution to the problem of life. How are you going to get around without money? There's always a way. And you borrow something, you forget to give it back, and it's very charming.
There is a younger artist, to your question, I was just looking at, and I'm sorry to say I can't remember his name, but speaking of boosting, he makes found object sculptures out of those variously shaped metal spiky things that keep people from sitting on doorsteps or walls.
Yeah.
And he seals them.
Yeah.
And shows them as sculpture.
Ivan, in the back, you have a question?
I think he would have liked Rashid Johnson, so there's an artist. But could you talk about his time at Grant Street and his writings?
Well, he didn't so much have writings at Grand Street, but what he did was come up with the artists that the magazine did portfolios of, and usually he would, Anne can speak more to this than I can, but usually he would come to New York for a weekend or a couple of days and go to every possible gallery and spot things, or go somewhere else and do the same thing. What was that process, Anne?
Part of the process in the interim, I would go to galleries and make up lists of things for him to look at. That didn't always go well. Sometimes we sort of worked it out. I would make a presentation to him of what I had seen, and he would come up with, again, sort of riffing on that. He would already have ideas about what artists he wanted to put in the magazine, and we'd sort of cobble together a mixture of stuff. But he didn't write. He would talk, and one or the other of us would tape him, or Jean would tape our founder and executive editor, Jean Stein, would tape him, or I would tape him, or Deborah would tape him, and then one of us would have to transcribe it. And that would be, it was how he worked at the Menil, too.
Can I bring up an anecdote?
Of course.
Howard, this is Howard Halley, who was also in that job at Grand Street for years. And
But to David's point about his Catholic tastes, right? I remember one of the first things I worked on for him was he wanted me to track down this woman photographer who I had never heard of, and unfortunately I can't remember anything anymore, but I don't remember her name. And she kind of made, you might have remembered this, she kind of made there were kind of gothic, pinhole, Camry kind of things. I don't know, it's hard to explain, but he had seen her work.
I was thinking Barbara S., but he wouldn't have known about Barbara S.
Yeah. It was somebody else. Barbara S. was sort of a known quantity at that point. But no, she was somebody I'd never heard of. He'd seen her work in Washington at the gallery that specialized in photography.
Mittendorf.
He had no idea where she was, and I had to find her. So
Oh.
it was like, and I tracked her down. I found her, and I said, Walter Hopp sent me, and he'd really like to do a portfolio of your work in the magazine. And she started crying on the phone because he remembered her. Like, it was sort of like, Walter wants me in the magazine? I said, yeah. And she was emotionally choked up about it because she was a person who, I think she was in Ohio or something. She was like complete obscurity. I have the thing somewhere in a box, somewhere at the bottom of the ocean, but that issue, I wish I could remember her name, but she was a very interesting, it was very felt work. I could see what he liked about it, but I'll never forget that. I'll never forget her reaction to
He-
him remembering her.
He told me once he remembered every single piece of art he had ever seen. And it made him crazy.
I believe it. I mean, yeah, it made him crazy. So,
Yes.
but yeah, I remember.
He also was very good at remembering where those pieces of art were, which would have earned him a fortune in an auction house.
Right. Yeah, I've known one other person who had that similar capacity. It was the dealer, Bruno Bischofberger. In Zurich.
Interesting.
Because Bruno can tell you where every single painting is in the world, in all the world's museums, and what wall they're on in those museums. And it's just, no one else has a memory like that. Walter had the kind of memory.
I didn't. He used to take me to museums, or I would go to museums with him, and he'd do spot quizzes. We'd leave a gallery, he'd go, okay, clockwise around the gallery, what was in the gallery? I got better at it.
Maybe one more question.
Okay, one more.
We are living in a very interesting political moment as it unfolds, just to state the obvious. I don't know, for me personally, I feel like delving into some art history stuff, reading about artists and how they sort of responded to contemporary events as they unfolded has been very cathartic for me in the past few days. So I guess I would just ask you guys, how would Walter process this current moment? And beyond Walter, I mean,
He did try to levitate the Pentagon with Allen Ginsberg.
I would just love to hear from you three because you have very impressive careers in arts, and I don't know. There's no specific question, to be honest, tied to this. I'm here because I've been gravitating toward the arts and art history, and just it's been a balm for me in the past few days. So I would love to hear you guys speak to that and how you're sort of processing what's going on right now.
If we're processing what's going on right
I'm
now.
not sure we're processing yet.
I have been thinking about it a fair amount because in the 60s and into the 70s, there were massive protests, mostly against the war, but not only. No one can ever know if they had any effect on policy at all. I mean, when was the gigantic march on the Pentagon? Was in 67? Well, the war
That's
didn't
right.
until 73, so it was 6 more years of Vietnam War. So you could say it had no effect at all. But maybe it did. It's not that Nixon was listening, and he was listening in the most nefarious,
Civil
paranoid way.
rights, though.
What's that?
I would disagree in terms of civil rights and
Well-
what, LBJ was able to.
Yeah, I'm not saying it was futile in every regard, but I think that was a case where the will of the people was more aligned with the administration's goals. But in the opposite case, when the will of the people is completely diametrically opposed to the administration's goals, I don't know. I'm not saying it does or doesn't. I just don't know. It's unquantifiable. What would artists have done if this situation had occurred in the 60s? People were just as freaked out as we are, but I don't know if anyone would have had an idea what to do about it.
I'd say we are living in truly terrifying times, and there is quite a lot of art being made that is attempting at least to address events in the world. As in my job, I look at a lot of it, and I'm reassured that people are seeing events in the world and making art about them. That doesn't necessarily mean that all artists are good at that. A lot of artists aren't. But there is some really good art being made, and I think Walter would have, he was pretty political, especially in his years in Washington. He got interested in politics just like he got interested in music or physics or, wherever he was, he got interested in stuff. He would have wanted to see more, I think. I do.
He never forgave FDR for dumping Wallace for Truman. He talked about it to me. I mean, I'm like, you got to be kidding me, Henry Wallace. I mean, it still bugged him.
Yeah.
As well, it should have.
Well, yeah,
But moving on.
Yeah,
Right?
right.
But it's a wonderful question. I don't have an answer. I wish there were one. People do what they feel compelled to do, make work that brings certain things to light, or just do street protests. But I'm someone who doesn't have much faith in the efficacy of those kinds of things. But that doesn't mean people shouldn't do them, or they don't have some sort of cumulative, energetic effect in the world.
I want to believe they have a cumulative effect, but not sure.
On that note, and as Volker wrote, we'll live the question maybe. But thank you, Deborah, Ann, and David. Another round of